I have the privilege and honor of introducing our first panel today, the New Village People, TOD in the Bay Area. The work of these panelists and other community planners are critical to California's continued success and growth. As you may know, California has experienced a tremendous population boom in the last 50 years. According to U.S. Census data in 1950, the state had roughly 10.5 million people living here. As of 2015, it was a little bit over 38 million. That is a 350% increase in California's population in just 50 years. That's astounding. With their work and the work of other community planners, we are getting sustainable, attractive, highly desirable housing of greater density than we've ever had before. And this housing is not only green building and sustainable, it's taking cars off the road, it's reducing traffic, and it's also helping California comply with the California Global Warming Solutions Act. And what they're doing is critical to our continued success. Today's moderator is Rabalais. He's a long-range asset development manager of the San Francisco Metropolitan Transportation Agency. In that position, Rafe, why don't you come on up? He manages several TOD initiatives, including multiple properties under SFMTA's jurisdiction. Several of those are currently in the development stage, and he has several RFPs that they're working with. Prior to joining the SFMTA, Rafe worked in the city of New Orleans and has a background in urban planning. He and his wife are the proud parents of a young boy, and Rafe hopes to impart his passion for housing, transportation, and urban planning in his son. So, Rafe, thank you for your time today. I'd like to bring up Nathan Hong. He's a Senior Vice President of Development of AvalonBay, Northern California. Nathan has more than 30 years of experience in all aspects of real estate development, construction, and management. As Senior Vice President of AvalonBay, Mr. Hong is responsible for overseeing and managing new and existing communities and the acquisition and development of other communities in the Northern California region. Prior to AvalonBay, Mr. Hong was a managing director for Oliver McMillan, a real estate developer and owner. Thank you, Nathan, for being part of today's panel. I'd like to introduce you to Hillary Gitelman, Director of Planning and Community Environment for the City of Palo Alto. Hillary has worked in the public sector as a planner in the San Francisco Bay Area for over 20 years. Hillary joined the City of Palo Alto in 2013 and oversees a program that includes current and long-range planning, transportation, and code enforcement. Prior to working with the City of Palo Alto, she spent many years as planning director for Napa County. And finally, we have Sean Brooks, Director, Manager of Real Estate and Property Development for BART. Sean Brooks joined BART in September 2015, and in his role oversees all transit-oriented development projects and real estate interests. Mr. Brooks has held previous economic and real estate development roles for the City of Redwood City, the City of Hayward, and the City of Brea. Sean is an active member of the Urban Land Institute and was recognized as a San Francisco Business Times Class of 2015 40 Under 40 honoree. So thank you all for your time today. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. I'm sure the audience shares that. And with that, Rafe, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. We thought that we would start before kind of launching into our discussion, that it would be helpful just to kind of give a little bit of an introduction just to the concept of transit-oriented development and the kinds of transit-oriented developments that all of us personally are working on, just to give you kind of a sense of the flavor of what's happening within the Bay Area and the diversity and breadth of TOD projects in the Bay Area. So first, I thought it would be helpful just to kind of start with a definition. This is probably a term that most of you are familiar with, but we have three definitions of what a transit-oriented development or a TOD is. First one from the Sustainable Cities Institute defines it as an approach to development that focuses land uses around a transit station or within a transit corridor. Second one from Reconnecting America is a little bit more kind of definitive and prescriptive in terms of distances and design type, but it describes it as a type of community development that includes a mixture of housing, office, retail, and/or other amenities integrated into a walkable neighborhood and located within a half-mile of quality public transportation. And the third from noted planning and TOD expert resource Wikipedia is a type of urban development that maximizes the amount of residential, business, and leisure space within walking distance of public transport. So a lot of overlap in these definitions. Probably the easiest way to define TOD is really to define it as what it's not. We can all kind of agree that this type of development typology, which dominated American development after World War II, focused on arterial roads and freeways and manifesting itself in cul-de-sac subdivisions and very segregated land uses. This is the opposite of transit-oriented development. But what's interesting, and when you look at TOD in the Bay Area, you see kind of an example of this, is that TOD can really be everything from this, which is kind of low-rise, mid-rise, attractive human-scale development, and this is in Charlotte, North Carolina, adjacent to a new light rail line there, to this, which is Hong Kong, hyperdensity. The interesting thing, what really struck me in looking at this image, though, is as much as this seems kind of foreign and massive in scale, we really essentially see the spectrum within the Bay Area, that you have in the more kind of suburban communities within the Bay Area, some low-rise, 3-4-story development with a mix of uses, but then we have density that's approaching Asian megacity density around the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco, which of course is under construction. Second largest building on the West Coast is currently under construction, the Salesforce Tower. A number of other super tall buildings are under construction as well. So we see exactly this kind of range within the Bay Area. So size and scale, this is one of the dimensions that really we see some variability in. Another one is the transit infrastructure that these TODs interface with. We have a very diverse transit system within the Bay Area, everything from bus rapid transit to light rail transit to heavy rail in the form of BART, commuter rail, and so the intensity of development in some ways kind of corresponds to the volume and the capacity of those transit systems that serves those TODs. And then also location and neighborhood context. Some of the TOD projects are on multi-acre sites that are, if not greenfield sites, they're sites that can be master planned. And then you see that kind of on one end of the spectrum, and then on the other end of the spectrum, and we'll talk about this in terms of some of the projects that the SFMTA in San Francisco is working on, some of the projects in the city of Palo Alto. On the opposite end of the spectrum are fully built out communities, and it's a question of how do you find these kind of opportunity sites within those communities to enhance density around transit stations. So just kind of a quick overview of some of the projects that we're all working on. We start with BART, which of course has a tremendous footprint in many of the counties comprising the Bay Area, and whose footprint is growing, of course, with a couple of extensions in BART service. And you can see the color-coded status of a lot of these projects, everything from completed projects, which is kind of the purple color, to projects that are in the preliminary negotiation stage with developers. And this is something that BART has been at for a number of years now. So there are completed projects, there are projects that are under construction, and projects that are in kind of the pre-development pipeline. $1.2 billion in projects overall, and BART is also looking at opportunities to enhance density around a number of these stations. And in addition to the projects that are already in kind of the definitive development pipeline, BART is also looking at opportunities at these other stations, Balboa Park, Lake Merritt, in Oakland, El Cerrito Plaza, Concord, and the North Concord Martinez station. You can also see that this is an important leg of the revenue stool for BART. Certainly an ancillary source of revenue, currently at about $600,000, $700,000 a year, but anticipated to really grow substantially over the next several years to about $5.5 million, with that revenue really ramping up around 2021 and 2022 with changes in lease terms to existing TODs and as new TODs come online on BART-owned properties or BART-adjacent properties. And then kind of zooming in a little bit from the 30,000-foot level to a little bit closer in, we're privileged to have On this panel, BART, Sean here representing BART, and Nathan representing AvalonBay. And AvalonBay has worked on a number of these TODs as public-private partnerships with BART. So one is Avalon Walnut Creek, which is an 18-acre development adjacent to the Pleasant Hill BART station in the Walnut Creek area, 622 residential units, a new BART parking garage to accommodate park and ride commuters. And this is a project that started in 2005 and is ongoing. Another one is the Dublin Station project adjacent to the Dublin Pleasanton Station. This is another public-private partnership between AvalonBay, BART, and Alameda County. This is a 14-acre project with more units, 800 units, a replacement BART parking garage or new BART parking garage, and a project that just recently wrapped up its final phase in 2016. And then some of the projects that we're working on, the SFMTA in San Francisco, we as an agency have kind of limited experience with transit-oriented development. We have a project on the Embarcadero that is a hotel that has been in operation since 2005, and that's provided several $1 million of revenue to the agency. But we have kind of ramped up our efforts in the TOD sphere in recent years. And this is one project that we're working on, which is an exciting project because it's really integrated with a brand new subway line. That's an extension of a light rail line that's going to go from the Caltrain station to the Chinatown neighborhood. And this property, it's a small property, so again, the footprint of the kinds of properties that we're working on is pretty small, just 8,400 square feet. But we're looking to do affordable housing, up to about 105 units of affordable housing with ground floor commercial development. And what's exciting from the standpoint of how we program these sites is that we're really looking to do model transit-oriented development with transportation demand management measures that encourage people to not drive. None of, not this particular project and other projects that we're working on will have no on-site parking. So there's a strong push to get people to walk and use transit, which is easier in San Francisco than in some other communities, of course, given the transit infrastructure. And this is a project we hope to be issuing a developer RFP this year at some point. Then another exciting project or type of projects that we're working on is several of our bus yards for the Muni system. These are large sites for us. It's not a 14-acre site or an 18-acre site, but these are 2.5 acres up to 6 acres. And these are properties by virtue of property values in San Francisco. You can explore this kind of development typology of vertical development adjacent to and above an active bus storage and maintenance facility. As far as we can tell, this is something that no other jurisdiction in the country is pursuing, where there's an active bus facility. The closest thing to it would be in New York City, where there are rail yards, like the Hudson Yards development or the Atlantic Yards development in Brooklyn. But in terms of co-locating active residential development or commercial development along with a bus facility, this is something that we're kind of in the feasibility stage, where we're doing a deep dive feasibility-wise to see how this pencils and whether or not some of these projects can essentially subsidize the capital needs that we have to improve our bus facilities, many of which are older and need seismic upgrades. And then finally, City of Palo Alto, just to highlight a couple of projects right here in our backyard. Here's one project that was completed in 2013, 801 Alma, which is 50 units of affordable housing. This is on the site of a less intense use that was a former auto repair shop, and this is located about a quarter mile away from the University Avenue Caltrain station, kind of at the edge of downtown Palo Alto, so a great location. And again, this highlights in a community that is thriving, that's attractive, that's built out, kind of the difficulty of finding good sites and the opportunity that comes when we are able to kind of transition something to a greater intensity close to a rail facility. And then also in Palo Alto is 2500 El Camino Real, which is 70 units of affordable housing. This is on a site that's owned by Stanford University and a little more than a quarter mile away from the California Avenue Caltrain station and the retail corridor there. And this is a project that's currently nearing completion. So clearly, a pretty substantial breadth of projects that we're seeing in the Bay Area. And again, this is just really the tip of the iceberg, just a small sampling of projects that are projects that all of us on the stage have personally worked on. So I guess my first question for our panel is constantly changing development landscape, obviously, in the Bay Area. And the question really for all of you, whoever wants to jump in, is where we see essentially the greatest growth in transit-oriented development opportunities happening, where we have a couple of different kind of categories of development opportunities. There are kind of the Palo Alto category, where we have existing built-out communities, and the challenge is finding density or increasing density within those communities, maybe larger opportunity sites adjacent to some of the BART stations. And then I guess the third category would be the expansion to the transit system throughout the Bay Area with the BART extensions. So the question, not that it has to be an either-or kind of answer, but where do we see essentially the greatest growth in TOD happening within the geography of the Bay Area?
Should I go first?
Go for it.
Well, you know, I mean, I think thinking about the Bay Area, and we work around the Bay Area, so, you know, there's VTA sites, there's additional BART sites, and I guess when I think about TOD, it's TOD right at the transit agency's property, which the two were shown were. And then there are also those, I guess, even when we've talked about a TOD by proxy, or you can be building within a few blocks of a transit station, and that kind of, you know, accomplishes the same thing, I think, in terms of, you know, when somebody's living right across the street from the transit station, or whether they're walking a block or two, I think that's fairly reasonable. Where that could be, I mean, I think, you know, if I work from the center out, there are those Valley Transit Authority spots that I think, and actually one has been out on an RFP that we've taken a look at. BART is, I think, doing a lot of work in terms of where, you know, where they're thinking that there could be more opportunities. And then I think, you know, there's actually another element to it that maybe I won't go too far into it, but those are opportunities that make sense for the transit agency. I think the various cities that these are also need to somewhat, you know, obviously be involved and embrace that.
Your mic.
I think I hear me going in and out, but so hopefully you caught most of that.
Well, I guess from a very local perspective here in Palo Alto, Rafe talked about the fact that we're really site constrained within Palo Alto. But in our immediate area, I think the challenge is that we're seeing a lot of development along the bay where there isn't a lot of transit service. So the question is, you know, what's the future of transit-oriented development when the development is happening pretty far away from the transit? It's ultimately going to require a lot of investment on the transit provider side to serve these areas. If you look just at Redwood City, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, Mountain View, we're talking about maybe 11 million square feet of office commercial development and 20,000 units in the planning stages in those communities. So that's...
And those are developments that are not especially close to Caltrain, is what you're saying.
That's right. They're along the bay, away from Caltrain, away from our major bus corridor, which is the El Camino Real. So we really have a challenge. If we believe in transit-oriented development, how are we going to cope and adapt to this development pattern?
From BART's perspective, if we take a step back, I think the greatest opportunities for TOD development are opportunities to work in communities that embrace BART. And so what I mean by that is that we've taken a very high-level, ambitious approach with a new TOD policy, essentially saying that we're going to prioritize working in communities that have the level of densities that we're looking for, that have updated specific area plans that are conducive to our development needs. So with that in mind, really communities that really have adopted density, that have access plans that are conducive to walking, to pedestrian access. So when I think of it in that terms or perspective, it's really those areas that have taken a stance to say that we welcome height, we really welcome densities north of 75 units per acre, and so those are the areas that we would prioritize. Also, being the fact that 80% of our users or 80% of our trips are work-related trips, areas where we have a great opportunity to really foster commercial development. And so where we look at stations that have, especially our East Bay stations, an office market, those are stations that would rise to the top of our priority list in terms of development. So I would say all our stations, there's going to be a variety of opportunities for development, but those that are most ambitious at the local level, that have the appetite for high intensity or high density, those are the ones that would rise to the top.
That's great. And Sean, that kind of segues, I guess, to the next question. BART is, of course, a fascinating system, and kind of we can kind of track, I guess, development trends through the evolution of BART, where BART, obviously, from the outset, had certain stations that were urban stations, but really a lot of the BART model was kind of built on, for many of the stations, on more of kind of a park and ride model. People park at the station, maybe it's surrounded by, there's an adjacent garage or a surface parking lot, and then they change modes and take a train to Berkeley or Oakland or the financial district in San Francisco. Could you talk specifically about some of the kind of forthcoming generation? You know, what are some sites, some specific BART stations where some of the planning is going on right now for things that, you know, stations where we're not seeing dirt turned yet, but where in the next several years we could see some activity there?
Yeah, so in terms of future opportunities, and maybe before we segue in that, we'll talk about kind of the evolution of time in terms of what's happened. As you alluded to earlier, obviously the system was built as a park and ride system, but as the population has grown, as people have become more conducive to TOD, walking, biking, and so forth, we've seen less parking at our stations. And so to some, that may be a sticker shocker, but to others, it's a welcome change. So I say that under just the facts that our ridership has grown over the last 5 years by 80 to 100,000 riders during that time frame, when we only provided an additional 2,000 to 3,000 parking spaces, and my numbers may be off a little bit, but people have found a way to get to our stations without having a parking space at those stations. So with that being said, then really being able to access our stations by another means is going to be critical to us in the future. So in terms of other sites that we may have not heard about, obviously those that were on the board earlier, we've been involved in some planning aspects with the city of El Cerrito with their 2 stations to kind of see some developments fostered there. There's a huge opportunity at North Concord Martinez with the master developer. They selected Lennar, and so there's an opportunity to really include the BART site. It's 17 acres there. That's really the epicenter of where the development will start from, and then branch out to the former naval base. And then we have a plethora of opportunities in the East Bay. We know as BART comes on and BART expands out to eastern Contra Costa County, obviously those stations such as North Concord, Pittsburgh, that were heavily parking centered may not need as many parking spaces. So we've started discussions with those communities as well. And I think one of our success stories is definitely West Dublin, Pleasanton, and John Reynolds is the project manager there. He's in the room as well, really looking at opportunities there for a hotel as well as some further office. And so this would help with our East Bay reverse commutes that we're really trying to emphasize, to really take out some of the stress from our system, as most people commute into the city during the AM hours and they commute out in the PM hours. So we want to help curb some of those traffic trends by being able to have people commute to the East Bay for work. And so we're really being thoughtful in terms of how to program for office development at our East Bay stations.
That's interesting. And what have you found? Obviously, the book of work that BART has completed is really impressive in the TOD sphere. And when you look at transit agencies throughout the United States, there are really a handful that have done the kind of volume of TOD activity that BART has done, a pretty small number. So it's a small cohort. And I think it's a testament, obviously, to the vision of the agency and kind of recognizing those opportunities and following through on them. But what would you say have been kind of past tense as well as future present or future tense, what have been the biggest stumbling blocks, essentially, in realizing those TOD visions? And we all know, obviously, any development project is fraught with pitfalls and obstacles, but what have you found to be the biggest kind of challenges to bring those to fruition?
Yeah, when I got started in real estate, I heard the term that it was all about location, location, location. But the more that I was involved, it's really about timing, timing, timing. Mm-hmm. So these projects take on a life of their own. They span over years and years. So really, marketing timing is critical. Obviously, to ensure that a development moves forward, it has to make economic sense. So I think that's one aspect. Also, we work in various jurisdictions with various interests from different partners, and so really aligning those interests together. So there's numerous amount of community meetings, outreach that goes on, and so depending on the council member or the leaders, those interests change over time, and so that's always a pitfall that you have to move forward. But really also being able to structure deals that allow for a level of flexibility and collaboration. So BART, has looked at really having good partners that when there are market hiccups, that we can still continue to move forward. I think some of the other challenges have been, it is very expensive to build parking structures. And so early on in the process, essentially we had a one-to-one parking replacement parking requirement. That's subsequently been dropped. And so at MacArthur, you'll find the ratio was 0.75. And so in other places, it may be 0.5, and it may be 0 at some locations. At Lake Merritt, whenever we do issue our RFQ, RFP process, there may not be any replacement parking for our transit at that facility. So just a huge cost of infrastructure in terms of parking has been something that has, it's a big undertaking in terms of underwrite. And then I think the other point, as we move forward, the loss of redevelopment is going to be a critical asset that we'll need to replace. And so we use redevelopment funds, Prop 1C funds, and other funds, other subsidy funds to find money for replacement parking. That's no longer there. I mean, it also help with infrastructure as well. So finding another public funding source for that is going to be critical. But I think, at the end of the day, it really is aligning a variety of interests together and making sure that projects can continue to move forward even when hiccups occur within the market.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting observation, too. I was thinking as you were talking that a unique challenge of an agency like BART is working in so many different jurisdictions, so different land use regulations, different just kind of regulatory environment and community input kind of environment in all of those jurisdictions. And by contrast, that's something just working within the city of San Francisco that we don't have to grapple with. It can be a challenging environment, obviously, for building and development, but there's not that distinction on a station-by-station basis or site-by-site basis of working with one jurisdiction or another jurisdiction. One question, too, as you move forward, BART is, obviously, there are several extensions to the system. How is transit-oriented development kind of factoring into the planning of those stations and the station areas? Because, obviously, again, it's a different development context than in the 1960s when a lot of the BART system was being planned. What are some of the considerations that are going into station planning in that regard?
As our system has matured, obviously, when we first started, it was all about transportation and getting person from A to B. And so when we designed new stations, it was about schedule, scope, and delivery, being able to bring the transit to a community and be able to run cars. What we've learned over time is really that community to where that station is at takes on a greater life, greater means. And so at our newer stations that we're developing, and even those that we currently have, we're going back in and really creating the sense of place, a placemaking experience, and seeing, well, how does this station operate with the greater station area that's there? How will the retail function? We've given some thoughts in terms of access improvements, in terms of sidewalks. Those are things that I think were afterthoughts back in the 70s and 80s, and now we're figuring out, how do the streets work? How do bikes work? How do our shuttles work? Because now people are utilizing shuttle drop-offs to connect to other transit or to other job placement centers, as well as bikes. And so I think we, as real estate professionals at BART, are brought into the process a whole lot earlier than we were previously in terms of designing stations. I think what was pretty catalytic, and John worked in this project too, in terms of Warm Springs, there was an opportunity to connect to the west side of that station in terms of the former NUMMI plant, essentially. And so it was crossing over a UP railroad, and so real estate was brought in early enough to think about the connection that could be made. At that point in time, it was just a single user, but who would know the forethought that Tesla would come into place. By now programming a pedestrian bridge, once that station is ready to go and that bridge is built, that will be able to connect others to the west side of that station via jobs as well as future housing. And so that's increased the land value for that innovation center that Fremont has as well. So that's just one example in terms of having us at the table earlier in the process. It can provide for an opportunity to really connect to the community at a greater level.
That's great. So a lot of focus on design, it sounds like, and just kind of how it integrates with the surrounding community. And that's the design topic is a topic, I think, especially it's important with any kind of development, any kind of transit-oriented development, but is certainly aesthetic issues and design issues. That's something that is of particular importance to a community like Palo Alto, which has an established, thriving downtown. Hillary, could you talk about maybe some of the opportunity sites that have been identified through the years, or maybe, again, the next generation of opportunity sites in and around the Caltrain stations in Palo Alto, and what those look like, and how you go about examining those from a zoning standpoint or land use standpoint?
Wow, I mean, I'll tell you that sites are really the constraint in a community like Palo Alto. I mean, we have a community that is passionate about preserving its community character and that is largely built out. If you look at the city generally, about 45% of our land area is set aside as open space. It's either on the bay or up in the hills. About 25% of our community is single-family housing and zoned just for single-family. And only, well, less than 5% of our community is zoned for mixed-use or multifamily housing. Means it's really hard to find a piece of vacant land. In fact, there was one covered in the newspaper earlier this week, because we're talking about it at our council meeting on Monday, and it's the only one that anyone could think of. So we're talking about if we want to build something close to Caltrain, really adding density to sites that are already developed or replacing existing developments, and there just are not a lot of opportunities. So I would really say that site availability is the primary constraint for transit-oriented development in Palo Alto. And then we also have the issue that you refer to as design or aesthetics, and I would maybe say it a little broader. It's more about community acceptance. We in Palo Alto, and I think many local jurisdictions in the Bay Area, are suspicious of regional planning. You know, the Plan Bay Area process that goes on through ABAG and MTC is looked at a little suspiciously. Similarly, the Grand Boulevard Initiative that's looking at transit and transit-oriented development along El Camino Real up and down the peninsula. You know, we're aware of it, we participate, but there's always a little suspicion here in Palo Alto that it's, I don't know, that it's somehow going to make us do something we don't want to do.
Well, it's a different conversation when you're when you're looking at a map and it's the entire Bay Area and it's vaguely defined shaded areas where the density is supposed to go, and it's a different conversation when you're looking at block faces and individual buildings.
That's right, and our community really treasures what we have. And so something that is viewed as maybe, you know, precipitating a change in a dramatic way is always difficult. You know, with that, you know, we're at an interesting moment here in Palo Alto. I've been here for about 3 years. I started with the city the week after the voters overturned a 60-unit senior affordable housing project that had been approved unanimously by the city council. So we've been, since that time, in kind of a no or slow growth phase. Just recently, you know, it's starting to change, and those of us who work in local politics or with a variety of local agencies know, you know, that these changes can be very subtle. It takes kind of a while to figure out what's happening, but we sense, whether it's because of the acuteness of the housing challenge in the Bay Area, or just because of something else that's in the water, you know, a little bit of easing up on this and some opportunities, we hope, in the next several years to advance some transit-oriented development through our general plan and zoning, the zoning changes that will come out of that general plan process.
Well, and that kind of was going to be my next question. What we've seen in the city of San Francisco is kind of a nascent YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, where I don't know that's proportionally if it's greater than the NIMBY component, but it's they're certainly there, and they're increasingly outspoken at meetings in favor of development. And so to what extent is there a nascent kind of interest or grassroots interest in really going for a more kind of intensive look at TOD opportunity sites? And by that, I mean looking at the community plan process and saying, here's a perfectly attractive 1- to 2-story building, but maybe this can be a 5- or 6-story building. Is there any kind of momentum within Palo Alto for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what we're feeling. There have been increasingly speakers coming to the podium at the council meeting saying, you know, yes, we want to pursue more multifamily housing. We actually had the council encourage and a developer step forward to propose a 60-unit project on a very small site. It used to be a VTA parking lot at the corner of Page Mill and El Camino. So it's the geographic center of Palo Alto. And the council wants to test this idea of small units on a small site with a reduced parking. And we have an active application right now to see if we can't move that forward. It needs all kinds of legislative changes as well as a project entitlement. So we'll, you know, it's going to take us a while to get through that process, and maybe this time next year
Kind of a trial balloon.
I'll tell you how it goes.
That's interesting. And one more question just about in the development dynamics. Obviously, as a community, as a region, we're comprised of cities, jurisdictions that are all over kind of the spectrum in terms of size, density, population. But for communities that are around kind of the size of Palo Alto, not in Oakland, not a San Francisco, not a San Jose, what are some communities, or are there any communities within the Bay Area that you think are kind of maybe striking that balance of between accommodating existing community character, but maybe pushing the envelope a little bit in terms of density around their transit infrastructure?
Well, just in this area, I think most people would agree that Redwood City and Mountain View have done a lot of development in the last 20 years or so, a lot of it transit-oriented development, and they've been very successful at that. But those are communities, again, that are starting to look towards vacant sites that are some distance from transit. So, it's an evolution, I think, in even these communities with a history of TOD.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting, I would think, too, because case studies are things that people can sink their teeth into. So perhaps as we see what works or what doesn't work in those communities, then that will maybe give people some either comfort or anxiety about
Probably both.
that spreading to, right, exactly, probably a little bit of both, spreading to other communities. So stepping back a little bit from the particulars of a particular agency like BART or a jurisdiction like Palo Alto, Nathan, just some questions for you as working for a development company that has really been at the forefront of pursuing ambitious transit-oriented development projects. Just have a couple of questions about the kind of larger kind of market picture. This is something, really TOD as a concept, I think we could probably point back to Arlington, Virginia as one of the first kind of exemplars of TOD practices in the 1970s, linking up with the Washington Metro system. But it's really more recently that we've started to see it grow around the country and within the Bay Area. So I guess my question would be, to what extent are we seeing these developments really thrive from a market standpoint? Do we see vacancies at a lower level than at other, of course we're in a strong housing market generally, but from what you know about TODs relative to more kind of conventional developments, how is their market performance kind of stacked up in terms of vacancy and rental rates or sale prices?
Yeah, it's well, interesting. You mentioned Arlington, Virginia, because that's where our headquarters is. But I'm here in the Northern California office and run this development group. But there's linkages with all of that. I think in terms of TODs and how that's evolving. We've worked with BART for over a decade. I think our first transit-oriented development was actually in Union City. Our second one was at the Dublin station. Our third one was at the Pleasant Hill BART station. We also have one in Ocean Avenue by San Francisco by the Balboa Park station. And I guess in so many respects, as I said earlier, there's TOD could be kind of, if you're near a transit stop and whether you're on it or you're around it, that it counts, I guess. In terms of, propensity for rents and attractiveness, I think it's an important factor. I mean, it's important when residents and the people are looking for where they rent. That is one major factor, especially I think as we've seen it evolve more so now. Back in 2002, 2003, when we did the first deal with John here, and cars, as Sean said, we built the replacement garage 1-to-1, and various cities that we go into also required parking ratios of 1.5. At Dublin, we have a 1.5 ratio, and actually after we built it, one of my managers came up and said, our top deck is empty. I mean, so that in and of itself signals that, I think a lot of people, even at that time, were, looking to use BART and less cars, but still, even now, as we kind of evaluate our residents and see what they're working towards and how they use public transit. I'd say, and I'll just throw this out there because it's probably some question that I know John asked me, and a lot of people are probably thinking, how many of our residents, actually use BART? And it's not, and for us, it's a moving target, so it's really hard to nail down, but there's, call it half, in the neighborhood of half the residents that live in our communities, use BART every day, and probably a whole lot more, over the course of a month, let's say. So is TOD something that is a driving factor for them to rent there? Yes. Is it a factor that garners a premium? I say that's probably a little bit harder to quantify. And the reason I say that, it's because, as we have, as the many that I've described, when it's still, real estate is kind of, it's a personal, emotional choice for residents. And there's the design element, there's the surrounding neighborhood element, there's the commercial, the retail element, there's how we manage the property. I would say that at Dublin, our first development, garnered some sort of a rent. Our last development at Dublin probably garnered a higher percentage rent, but that's also because of the surrounding development that's also occurred. So I think there's a lot of factors that come into it. TOD, I think, is a very important one, but the extreme is we could be right across the street from BART and we manage it poorly, and everybody goes across the street to the next development. So.
And would you say, as I mentioned kind of at the outset, we have a range of TODs throughout the Bay Area, from TODs on small sites within communities that are already kind of pedestrian-oriented communities and transit-heavy communities, but some of the projects that you've worked on are really a little bit more at the periphery, where we're talking about going from a different typology, essentially more the park and ride typology and more suburban typology, to one where there is more kind of mixed use, walkable, pedestrian-oriented and transit-oriented activity. And just generally speaking, how have those projects that are a little bit more on the periphery, how have those fared? Have those been, it's hard to kind of just categorically say successful or unsuccessful, but would you generally say that they've succeeded in their aims? Have they been financially successful? Have we seen changes in kind of transportation behavior for people that live there as opposed to in a more kind of suburban context?
Yes, they've been successful in terms of how people view them. I think I can throw out an example that most people are probably familiar with, Ocean Avenue in San Francisco by City College, or Avalon Ocean Avenue, which is probably a 10-minute walk, I'd say, to the Balboa Park Station. So it's not, it's not like Pleasant Hill BART where you're right on the BART property and you walk a block and you're there. So as an example, that when we first went there, this was in 2005, there was no really direct linkage in terms of working with BART because it wasn't a BART property, but I guess we could call that a transit-oriented development in that BART was nearby. The metro, the Muni line runs right across that, and there's the Phelan Loop transit circle, so there's many modes of transit there. When we did that transaction in 2005, I don't think that area of Ocean Avenue was really as developed, obviously, as it is now. And, kind of honestly, I think some people probably looked at me and said, why would you do that deal over there with nothing really there? So as it happened and as the stars aligned, there's a Whole Foods there now. The City College environment is kind of, even though City College has its things they've worked through, it's just a much more vibrant place now, and that's something that I think just kind of speaks to how development in general, by creating a place and getting the right retail tenant and collaborating with all of that to create something successful. So I think that can happen in other places as well.
Well, transit-oriented development concept is certainly one that we as a region, from a planning and land use standpoint, is one that we've put our we put our eggs in that basket. Because if you look at the Planned Bay Area plan, kind of the high-level planning that Hillary mentioned earlier, the priority development areas are pretty tightly construed, and they're along transit routes, and we're asking a lot, of course, in terms of additional growth and density within areas that are pretty narrowly defined. So we don't have a lot of greenfield opportunities. Within Planned Bay Area, I was reading that something like 86% of the growth that's anticipated in residential units is expected to be within the existing urbanized area, as opposed to growing the urbanized area. So this is something that we as a region certainly have to figure out. We are figuring out. There's been tremendous progress and a tremendous volume of transit-oriented development, but I would ask all our panelists what you see as kind of the best hope for TOD and the biggest kind of impediments to TOD being realized on a grand scale. There are a number of issues, obviously, just working in development, that everything from kind of the NIMBY factions in different communities that are anti-development, the CEQA process and entitlements process, that's tricky, but I'd be interested to hear from all of you what you think our easiest, our best path forward is and our biggest impediments are to kind of realizing the vision of Plan Bay Area in that regard.
Well, I was wondering when that CEQA process was going to come
There we
up.
go.
And actually, I have to say that, I'm a CEQA practitioner. I haven't been for a long time, and I don't agree that it is the main impediment to multifamily housing in the Bay Area, or if it is one of the main impediments, it shouldn't have to be. I think good planning and good CEQA review can happen and not get in the way of the kind of development pattern and development that we want to see in our communities. To me, I go back to the community acceptance issue. If 84% of our development in the next 20, 35 years is going to be in our transit-served areas, that tells me 15% of it is going to be out in the hinterlands. The reason that's happening is that people don't want it right near where they are, and they don't want their communities to change in a meaningful way. And I think that's a problem. And I think we like to congratulate ourselves here in the Bay Area on being so evolved and progressive. And it's going to take some introspection and real thought about how to really facilitate development within our communities, within areas that are already developed, where people already live, and do it in a way that is ultimately productive and doesn't take forever. CEQA can be used as a weapon, certainly, but the reason it's used as a weapon is that we haven't figured out as communities how to get along and come together around some of these objectives.
Comprehensively plan for development in that regard, right?
I guess, in terms of CEQA, I was kind of curious about when that would come up too, but I think I would kind of answer that question in maybe thinking about all the steps we go through and, challenges. I mean, there's challenges are at every step of the way. I mean, you mentioned it, Rafe, in terms of they're just fraught with those issues so I can list out all the challenges from the entitlement process. We go through the challenges of the community, the zoning. What's the envelope that we can build on? How zoning changed? In the developments we've worked on that have spanned the decade, different requirements have changed along the way. So how do we adjust to that? There's the community neighborhood groups that we're working with that we're in front of them presenting and getting their input and their comments. There's the planning commissions and the city councils. We go through the design stage, depending on the city that we're working on. Is there a town architect? There's another element of complexity that comes into that, to the marketplace. So, you start to layer that element into it. And then obviously there's we're bidding it and we're building it, and there's construction cost escalation. And so I think right now the hot button that everybody's somewhat talking about and knowing is that costs haven't really dropped and rents aren't actually going up. And so there's the whole financial element to that as well. And even during construction, the complexities of how is it financed. We've worked on projects that we've considered Melrose, we've considered SIDLAC financing. When you start overlaying all of that with the replacement garage structure that we built in, all of those issues are just something that are challenges all along the way. So I guess I've highlighted all the problems. So how do we
solve them?
How do we solve them? But I guess I'm proud, and having worked with BART over the decade and a half almost, the pictures are up there, so we've actually built it. I'd say the one thing that I know, Sean, John, and I have talked a lot about over the years is collaboration. And it's being able to work together in the relationships, and Sean said it too, in terms of flexibility of agreements. We've gone through agreements and we've amended them, but without all of us kind of respecting each other's vision and goals, those issues that came up, wouldn't be addressed. And I know that's maybe a bit cliche-ish, but we're still sitting on the same stage together, so I think it works. It's just kind of working through all those issues as they come up.
So in terms of opportunities and challenges, I think was the question. Opportunities, I don't think there's a better time in our history, at least locally, for TOD. And so I really get goosebumps looking at all the opportunities and all the situations that are presented to BART each and every day in terms of transit-oriented development. And a lot of that is due to you all here as being lawyers, developers, practitioners, and whatnot. There's more and more understanding of TOD, how it works and operates, and we have more and more of developers stepping up, asking us, how can we integrate better with BART? Case in point, we look at Uber. They're building a downtown campus at BART at our 19th Street station. Years ago, when BART came to a community, everyone wanted to put up their gates. And, you know, those are a certain demographic of people. They're not my customer. But now people realize that it all works together. And so now some of those gates or grills that were formerly closed, people want those open. And so Uber's work with us on a collaborative basis on how to provide more direct access from BART into their building. And so I think developers, with them stepping up saying, you know, how can we make this system work better? What can we contribute? What can we add? How can we, you know, add to the flow of this system? So I think from that perspective, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity as we move forward because we're not building any more freeways. And so transit is pivotal for our future. In terms of challenges, to develop on BART property, as many of you are aware, it's expensively high. So to build a product on BART, it's probably 10 to 15% premium as opposed to if you just went next door. So we have a prevailing wage, which is common with most public agencies, but then you add on a project labor agreement, you add on affordable housing requirement, now we're at 35%. And so that's a challenge, and so how do you make that work from a revenue perspective, from a financing perspective? Nathan talked about the construction costs there. And so I think those are the challenges moving forward. How much do we keep putting on the development community in order to provide for that product? At some point, you break the camel's back. And so I think we have to be very thoughtful as leaders within our local communities from a policy perspective, not adding on too much cost so that nothing gets built.
Right. I think that's a great observation. That's something that we certainly experience in the city of San Francisco as well, where you realize as a public agency, it's not just put a for sale sign or a for rent sign in front of the project and come give us what you have, but it's other competing kind of public demands from the standpoint of wages, from an affordable housing standpoint, or open space, or equity, generally, that those are kind of competing demands that all fundamentally kind of add costs. So, right, how do you kind of balance that with making sure that projects are financially feasible? Something, and this is more just kind of observation than a question, but I think Sean touched on a great point, and I wonder, to kind of, end this segment on an optimistic note, is I wonder to what extent TODs as a development typology could essentially really take off as there are just more and more of them. We're not having any numbers at my disposal. I would venture to guess over the last 20 years, it's even over the last 20 years, as we've seen kind of a shift in that direction, it's still a minority of units, housing units or commercial space that's in kind of this transit-oriented category, that most things have really been kind of suburban and suburban home builders and suburban office builders, and maybe as the industry adds more capacity and it becomes routine, not that any of these is ever routine, as Nathan suggested, but as it becomes more routine from a development standpoint, we'll see kind of a tipping point in terms of volume. So,
yeah. And to add to that, I think when BART initially started with TOD development, we were cautiously progressive. And so we dipped our foot in the pool a little bit. And, we were probably not as ambitious in the 80s and 90s as we are now. Now with Plan Bay Area, we have a backing, we have a lot of pioneers, and we have a lot of buy-in with communities really showing the benefits of TOD. And so as we move forward, things that we're proposing now are not as outlandish as they were 20 years ago. We participated with the Urban Land Institute on a TAP, and so all of our panelists said now is probably the right time. I mean, we were probably a little too early a few years ago, but now when we're introducing concepts, communities get it, especially with the regional affordable housing crisis that we're in, and so that's indicative of just what happened at MacArthur, our BART station. So originally it was zoned for 8 stories, and so the developer came and wanted to reprocess their application to increase the height to 24 stories. And so those initial design review committees, planning commission hearings and so forth, it was 50-50 split between NIMBYs and YIMBYs. And so last Wednesday, Planning Commission approved the project, recommended it for council, and with the speakers that came up, it was probably 85% in favor, 15% not in favor. And so the tide has shifted based on where we live, the climate that we're at. And so millennials, obviously, they're not looking to drive as much as former generations were, or generations before them. And so with those demographics changing, the aptitude for high-intensity TOD is definitely favorable as we move forward.
That's great. Well, I want to leave some time for kind of general audience questions, but we'll end on one final futurist question. And I don't know that anybody has a good crystal ball in this regard, but really the elephant in the room from a transportation standpoint is self-driving cars. And in my mind, that could manifest itself in anything from kind of a very ordinary way, where it's the same kind of commuting patterns, the same kind of development patterns, but you're hands off the wheel, something else is driving, to the opposite end of the spectrum, where it totally disrupts transit service, it totally disrupts car ownership, parking, all of those kinds of things. So I'd be interested real quickly just to know what your thoughts are, your fearless predictions in terms of self-driving cars and the impact on transit-oriented development in the future.
I'll be careful about predictions, but I'll kind of throw just my thoughts. Yeah, I think we're certainly at an inflection point in some ways with, I think we all know we are, in terms of self-driving cars and Uber pools. And I think from the residents and the people that live in the whether it's condos or apartments, how cars will be used in the future, I think, is definitely something to think about. I think I just read an article the other day where somebody in Miami Beach is wanting to convert parking garages to housing. We are seeing, in terms of our parking garages when we built, and I just mentioned it earlier, I mean, are we building too much? Certain cities we work in wants a 1.5 ratio, certain other cities, San Francisco, wants 0.5 or less. And so, and then you get the range all the way around the Bay Area. And then there's our own kind of resident usage, which, on average, we're between, I'd say, 1 to 1.3, and it's trying to line that up with what the cities require, and that kind of defines, what we build. But having said that, I think that in the future, it's probably conceivable. I think we can all say that less people will own cars. Right now, the challenge we have is, even as we build the TOD communities, yes, everybody takes BART, but everybody still owns a car that they need to park for the weekend. So we need to have the parking space. We're also kind of hearing and seeing that, that some of the residents maybe in the future will not buy cars. And I think as Uber pool works, and okay, I'll make a little prediction, that, maybe instead of, we've got electric car charging stations within our garages now. And that was implemented, 5 years ago when all the electric cars started going. So maybe somewhere in the future, a long ways, not too far away, that maybe there's a car drop-off, porte-cochere of sorts for, when you're leaving your community, whether it's a condo or an apartment, that you can get on your app and you hit a few buttons, and in 3 minutes, a chain of 5 self-driving cars pulls up and you hop in one. I mean, I don't know how, I'm saying that just kind of without thinking about it too much, other than I have read, that I think those are the things that some of the futurists are looking about, and it's maybe just something to consider and think about how that might work with mass transit as well.
In Palo Alto, we've been working on this general plan update for, it seems like 1,000 years, and my staff team and I have come up with, kind of a realization that a lot of the policy work we're doing around this question and other related questions could be put under the category of poised for change. So we're not going to commit to lower parking ratios, and we're not going to commit to other physical changes in the environment that might be an opportunity with self-driving cars and other societal changes. But we're ready, and we're going to be open-minded and poised to make those kind of changes in our parking requirements and in our cities if it lives up to its promise. I mean, I think we all realize that self-driving cars could make things a whole lot worse before they make it better in terms of congestion and parking demand. So we'll see.
Yeah, so the biggest advantage of self-driving cars, I think Nathan alluded to earlier, is really providing for less parking. And so when you provide for less parking, you have more real estate available for development. I was reading that in most cities or jurisdictions, 1/3 of the real estate is dedicated to parking. So such a value asset is used at something that's pretty stationary and doesn't provide as much economic value as it could. So if you're able to turn over those parking spaces to a much more active use, then how much more productive the Bay Area could be in terms of that. So I think that's the greatest opportunity for TOD. Obviously, you have to work out some of the details regarding that. And I think that it can also be used in conjunction with transit. We're already seeing within BART, people BART to certain locations, that last mile, they're taking an Uber or a Lyft to get to point A to point B. And so autonomous vehicle could help in those senses as well. And so I think we're starting also BART to look at autonomous vehicles as well as ride shares, not as a threat, but as a way that we can partner with those organizations to help increase the transit flows.
Right. Well, that's great. Well, that really kind of brings us to the end of our formal kind of question and answer and discussion period, but we have, I think, about 15 minutes for questions, so open it up.
This one's for Hillary. What's the current thinking about in downtown Palo Alto and some of the mid-peninsula areas where there's retail near the transit corridor, and behind the retail is a whole bunch of surface parking? What's the thinking about infill development in the airspace above those big parking lots behind retail?
Oh, that's a great question. I know in Palo Alto, our position on that is evolving. We updated our housing element a couple years ago, and posed this question to our policymakers. Is now the time that you want to redevelop these parking lots into housing? Potentially replacing the parking one for one, or even increasing the parking, but putting housing on top. And they weren't ready. So that was 2-3 years ago, and the answer was no. But just recently, we've proposed constructing a new parking garage downtown, and all of a sudden, they're talking about housing again. So I think we're right at the moment where it's starting to feel serious enough. Our need for smaller units to accommodate our workforce, our seniors. That we're gonna hear about these surface parking lots more and more. In the city of Palo Alto, we own a lot of them. The city owns a lot of them, so it's a real opportunity. And even if we start slowly, okay, let's take 1 or 2 of them. It's a process and an idea that could carry us for many years.
This is for Sean and Nathan. Would you mind touching on any creative financing devices, tax incentives, or other programs that you've used to make programs work financially?
So maybe we'll talk about in terms of, there's a current deal at Coliseum currently right now in terms of a parking arrangement. We've done this as well as with South Hayward. And so communities replacement parking is very critical. In order to effectuate a transaction, what we've been able to do in both of those scenarios, being able to work with those particular disciplines to provide for on-street parking that would be part of the overall BART system parking. So we would number spaces on the street. And so that's taking place already at South Hayward, and that's going to take place eventually at Coliseum as well. And so that helps that particular developer to meet their parking requirement, and it's a partnership between the developer, BART, and also the city. There's been other creative financing in terms of with our replacement parking in the past, where we required developers to build this huge parking structure that's $35–40 million up front, where we provide lease credits to the tune of a couple years to help offset that cost for that. And so the ground lease payments don't begin to years 10 or year 15 in regards to those scenarios. So those are just a couple examples largely around parking as well. Do you know it? Oh, John, maybe.
Yeah, just from, I guess, my perspective. So AvalonBay is a REIT, and so mostly we finance our properties off our balance sheet. But, so having said that, and Sean just kind of, mentioned replacement parking garages, and it's not creative, but in that one sense, but it was, there are certain structures in place that we had to work with BART, whether it's guarantees or something that are all part of that, because, in the sequence of events, we had to build a parking garage, guarantee that cost before the land would be available for us to build the apartments. So, but, you know, that's probably the simplest. I mean, probably the one that's a little bit more complicated was at Pleasant Hill BART, where I mentioned we did pursue SIDLAC financing. And that one, I think, was creative in the sense it was also complex, but it also involved the redevelopment agency at the time. So between considering Melrose, between considering select financing, between guarantees and you know, our capital, you know, I think I would try to less creative and simpler the better. They get pretty complex by itself. So, you know, my frame of mind, and as we've talked about things, is let's not make it any more complicated than we have to. And, you know, and Pleasant Hill BART is probably exactly one of those, because we worked out our arrangement in 2005, and 2008, we all know what happened, and we had to, you know, work together and restructure our agreements. And during that time, SIDLAC financing was in play, and it just needed, so it got complex, but we worked through it. So I guess that's a long answer, but the short answer is simpler the better.
I have a question of the panel. Do any of you see the day when you will have the opportunity to use our existing freeway rights of way for construction of more BART-like facilities? So you take the pressure off driving the automobile and just getting more BART systems out there to filter out into the neighborhoods? I've raised that question in the past. LA said, and when I was there 40 years ago, they said, too expensive. Now it's probably one of the cheapest things that could be done if people devoted some time and attention to really thinking about it.
So are you referring to running rail right along the freeway like we have 580 or extensions out in Dublin Pleasanton? Is that the question? More routes such as that? Yes. Okay. So as you're aware, we're expanding East Contra Costa County, so that line will, E-BART will eventually get to Antioch and quite possibly Brentwood. Right now, we're embarking upon a study to take the Dublin Pleasanton line to Livermore. So all that requires a considerable amount of funding. I think we're open to extensions as well, but also balancing that with the opportunities to grow our inner core. Because the further we expand out, the more and more it puts more pressure on our core capacity, which is most of those trips are going into downtown San Francisco. So it's the balance between dedicating resources to that as well as really helping to relieve some of our capacity issues. But I think all those things are on the table, and the Livermore seems like a real option that will come to fruition sometime soon.
And I think, just speaking for the city of San Francisco, there's been a push recently. We have a subway line that's under construction, and that isn't a freeway right-of-way, it's in an urban context. But really, there's momentum within the city to look for new and greater opportunities to really ambitiously expand the rail network in the city. So the city is embarking on a big transportation planning process in conjunction with the planning department, SFMTA, in conjunction with the planning to identify those new rail lines and high-priority rail lines in the city. It's not cheap, unfortunately, but especially in an urban context, but there's an interest. Yep.
One additional comment with regards to the Pleasant Hill project that AvalonBay has shown some creativity. They have FlexCar now within the development, and they'll have it in the second phase, as well as they participate in the Transit Demand Management, TDM program, which is probably the best throughout our system, and they're a participant as a result of their involvement with the Contra Costa Center Association.
One thing missing from this discussion has been local transportation systems. If the bus stops in your corner, you're in a TOD. I think this applies particularly to Palo Alto. And Hillary, you said that most of the housing development opportunities are along the shoreline. Is there any planning ahead to provide local transportation systems that would connect those housing opportunities with the larger transportation systems like VTA or BART or Caltrans?
Really, really good question. I think that was part of my point in raising this issue about the development pattern we're seeing. And I should clarify that is not happening in Palo Alto. That's in other jurisdictions in this area are looking at those properties along the 101 corridor as opportunity sites. Palo Alto really doesn't have that luxury. We have protected open space on that side of the freeway mostly. But you think about the Google stuff that's happening in Mountain View. I'm sure they have plans to serve it with their own transit, if not public transit. Same thing for the Facebook campus in Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. At least these developments are now having a mix of housing and commercial office development. But I think this is a trend in our region that is going to pose a challenge for transit providers and for the rest of us just trying to get around in the next so many years. So stay tuned. Let's see what happens.
I think your question was addressed to Hillary, but if I could just wanted to add a comment to that too. I totally agree. That it's not just, BART and of course is very important with the land property they have, but I mentioned, Ocean Avenue in San Francisco. Mission Bay is another one, and there are many nodes like that I think, cities and planners can think about where, can high-density housing work in those areas? Because, it's I think the same rules in theory could apply, if you hit those right nodes like Mission Bay, where we have 3 buildings and the F train or line that runs right through there with Caltrain across the street. So yes, I would consider that TOD as well. The difference there was as opposed to working with the complexity of, kind of a private-public partnership that was more working with Catalyst. But, there's still partnerships in play as that happens.
And I would say a critical piece to that is really parking ratios too, and pushing the envelope in that regard, because we're lucky enough in the region where a vast portion of the region compared to other parts of the country is well served at the very least by local bus service, if not by kind of higher capacity transit. So I think a big question as development comes online, and we talked a lot about parking ratios, but to what extent can we kind of divorce ourselves from this idea that there's 1 parking space or even 2 parking spaces for every residential unit, and instead parking being more of a luxury than a requirement, and that could hopefully push people in the direction of relying on buses.
We're going to go with Bruce next.
Well, having TODs expand is fantastic. To get community acceptance in all these places you're going to, one of the things you mentioned earlier was a sense of place. How do you develop a sense of place taking into consideration retailers? Do you come up with a retail strategy that the community will buy into? And then after that, how do you come up with a retail expansion execution plan? You have apartment communities and you have BART lines.
Retail, I would say, is we've had good success stories, and we've had some that need some work, to be honest. And if you all visualize, the ones that I've mentioned, Dublin, BART, we don't have retail, but that's actually good because Regency Center's opened up, I think, Persimmon's Place, and that's got a Whole Foods, a Home Goods, and a few other, good retail shops. Ocean Avenue, we've got a Whole Foods there ourselves, and that's worked out well. Pleasant Hill BART, it probably hasn't filled up as fast as we would have liked. Since we opened it, it was, I think, 2011, 2012, I forget exactly when, John, but in 2012, it took us a while to find the right groove, and I think that was a bit of a learning experience for us as well, because I think 2 things factored into that in my mind. One was understanding the what the BART, in this case Mass Transit BART ridership, was doing, and I think I do this myself. As I go to BART, I drive straight up to my parking space, and I run as fast as I can because I've got 2 minutes to get the train, and I'm not really looking to get a cup of coffee. I don't think I can bring a cup of coffee on BART anyways. So I think the retail that strategy probably now it has to be more of a place and maybe a mini destination is the way we're thinking about it. Earlier at Pleasant Hill BART, because of all the many factors that kind of went into getting approvals for the building. I mean, this is one that had a town architect, that had a redevelopment agency. We had a community group that had a say in terms of how it was designed. If I had to pick two things, the streetscape was a bit kind of large. Trees kind of grew and blocked the frontage. Signage wasn't as prominent as it should be. And so those things weren't there, so I think that detracted retailers. Now we've started to, make it more of a destination. We have a Michelin star restaurant in there. We have a Starbucks. We had engaged food trucks to open up on Thursdays and Fridays, and that's drawn people in. And we've signed a few other leases, more recently there, and it's become more of a place that kind of can attract people so that you're there as a mini destination. Because the same thing happens when you get off BART. You're trying to get home to your kids, your wife, and whatever else we all do, and you get off, and unless there's a reason to grab a beer off the food truck or something and hang out for a little bit, or come back later, you're just going straight to your car. So I think that's one of the things we're implementing now at the Pleasant Hill BART station.
I think we might have to have a whole panel next year on retail planning and development. We could talk about it for another hour.
It's a delicate balance.
And the only thing I would add is it has to be designed and programmed well. I mean, we can't just keep doing mixed use and expect that vertical mixed use is going to work in every environment. So we have to give that some thought before we roll out retails at our stations or in our communities.
A local planning person spoke very strongly that he thought that housing near transit did not significantly reduce car output and ridership, but office location near transit did. What's the panel's view of that evidence? And to what extent are we really able to meet our numeric objectives and find out whether we accomplished our goals with transit ridership increase, car decrease, and at what cost? How do we evaluate these projects?
I think I would agree with you in terms of every study that we've seen is that people are willing to walk a whole lot further in terms of housing choices, but work choices, when they take transit, they want that to be within a quarter of a mile or so. So we do experience a higher ridership when we have office closer to our stations. And so that's just, I think, an empirical fact that we've seen over time. In terms of evaluating where the TOD is successful, there's a variety of factors. Obviously, there's ridership, there's reducing of GHG, there's even safety issues in terms of when you have more people taking transit on the street, it helps to alleviate some of the crime within particular areas as well. So I think there's a variety of factors for that question. That's a loaded one.
Well, yeah, and I wouldn't, it's a relationship. The answer is there's a relationship where housing probably generates fewer transit trips, but you still get transit ridership out of having housing close to transit. So it's a question of relativity.
I guess, how do you evaluate it? I guess the thought that crosses my mind is in terms of people using the mass transit and, cars, are they, remaining in the parking lot? Maybe that's oversimplification of it. But, we know like in our garden communities, and if I were to guess, and they're not near transit, those folks are getting in their car and driving to work or driving to a BART station. We do, I think, know that at our, like say Dublin and Pleasant Hill BART, that a good percentage of the folks do take mass transit, and cars, say like half is approximately, cars remain in the garage. So, I think that's something we'll be tracking over time, because as more and more of that happens, we know the residents will, obviously are leaving their cars and taking BART. I think the other thing is, and same thing at Pleasant Hill BART, we actually have a parcel working with BART that's an office parcel. And one of the key things is in trying to, maybe it's not just residential and retail, it's how office kind of comes in with that. Because if there is an office component with any of these parcels, that also brings reverse ridership for BART. It also creates some synergy, I think, between the residents that could be there and the office and retail. And that could be something that could be synergistic all the way around.
One more question. I love the idea of TOD, but I'm actually looking at it from the opposite side. I lived in Sydney, Australia for a while, and they have a really robust ferry system. it seems to me that there's an opportunity here in the Bay Area to really alleviate some of the congestion, enhance the other forms of mass transit that we have with a ferry system that could help take the Google employees back and forth from San Francisco. And if we looked at it broadly as a series of transit nubs that all were interconnected either through self-driving cars or buses, we could really improve the overall transit and opportunity for people to get across the bay or up and down. Are any of you aware of any aspects of the ferry service being expanded? I know there's something small going to Treasure Island and Mission Bay, but more broadly, are any of you aware of discussions or opportunities for that?
I think it's a fantastic idea. I'm not beyond the examples that you mentioned, but I think that's a great idea to alleviate some of the capacity. Obviously, we have a finite amount of land and a finite amount of right-of-way and transit infrastructure, so I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm not up on the activities of the agency that was formed to push, to consolidate and expand ferry service in the Bay Area, but I know, they have a plan. They're starting to roll out services. I think South San Francisco is going to benefit first from some ferry service into their Bayside development area. But more than that, I don't know what their priorities are or what the time frame is for dramatically expanding that system.
I have one more question, primarily for Sean. I live in Marin County, and my observation is that the kids are really good at taking Ubers and Lyfts, but don't know anything about public transportation. Some people take the ferry into the city, but more people drive. Is Marin County a lost cause for transit-oriented development?
No one's ever a lost cause, but I would say that in terms of BART's expansion, it's probably within that inner ring with Alameda, Contra Costa County, San Mateo County, and Santa Clara County. So I think you would probably need to work with SMART, the Sonoma Rapid Transit, to figure out what their plans are. But until there's a massive amount of development in one place, I mean, you got to create these synergies of these areas and find cities that are willing to zone for higher density. And then I think the TOD can take place once you have a core synergy of density populated in certain areas.
I wanted to add to that a little bit. I mean, I agree. It's not a loss, never would be a lost cause. But I think one of the things that kind of translates to it from a development standpoint of having it actually make sense. So, just in an overview, it's the economics work. And I think it's great that I mean, over lunch we were talking about, it'd be great if we can all point to something that we could all say, yeah, it'd be great to have high density housing there. But the zoning has to work. And when I say the economics, unfortunately, construction cost to build in Sonoma is the same as construction cost to build in, I won't say San Francisco. There's a different San Francisco premium that's added on. But whether it's a podium or a wrap or some walk-up, it's pretty much the same cost. Then it becomes the rent structure, and then it becomes the land residual. And then it becomes how much those landowners are willing to negotiate.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I don't think our panelists are disappearing.